So what can you do to be sure that you're not caught by a catchphrase? Here are 6 suggestions. First, simply learn to detect and identify catchphrases that are occurring around you all the time, but maybe you didn't notice them before. Look for them in books and sermons and memes and podcasts. Be intentional in looking out for them, and teach your children to do the same so they also can learn to be discerning about catchphrases. Second, once you've identified a catchphrase, be sure to determine its meaning. It's important to be aware that a catchphrase may be being used differently by different people and at different times and contexts. So figure out exactly what the person who used the catchphrase meant to convey when they used it. And if you're the one who used the catchphrase, think carefully about what you meant when you used it. And if you're having trouble figuring out what you meant exactly, try rephrasing it in different words. And so you can have greater clarity about your thinking. And also be aware that when someone else uses a catchphrase, there may be ambiguity. It may not be clear exactly what they meant when they use that catchphrase. So if at all possible, ask the person if they can clarify what they meant when they use the catchphrase. And be aware that sometimes if a catchphrase's meaning is ambiguous, that may be unintentional. Maybe the person who used the catchphrase just failed to communicate clearly. But it's also a possibility, especially with false teachers, that they are being intentionally ambiguous, that they're using a catchphrase because they know that the point they want to make is controversial and they want to have deniability if they're called on it. So they just kind of hint at what they're trying to say by using a catchphrase and hiding behind ambiguity. This is a deceptive tactic that is actually common among false teachers, so it's something to be aware of. Third, evaluate the meaning of the catchphrase you have identified with the 2 prongs, scripture and careful reasoning. So with the scripture test, look in scripture to see if there is any explicit teaching that supports the point that's being made by a catchphrase or that undermines or contradicts it. And you can also look to see if there are any biblical figures whose are commendable and whose actions either support the point being made by a catchphrase or undermine it. Like I did, where I showed that the apostles and the prophets and Jesus weren't only known for what they were also known for what they were against. And so you can do that with catchphrases as well. And a great thing that comes when you evaluate catchphrases with scripture is that it will actually cause you to have to do a deep dive into scripture and to study it more. And that can help you grow in your knowledge of scripture and your spiritual walk. So this is just a great bonus that comes with practicing discernment. And also remember to use the second prong of evaluation to evaluate catchphrases with careful reasoning. And one way you can do that is by seeing if there are any logical fallacies being committed by the catchphrase. For example, are there any false dichotomies being employed by a catchphrase, like I showed in the examples of the catchphrases I evaluated? Fourth, if you determine that the catchphrase is not biblical or logical, and remember, those will always go together since God's nature is logical and his word will never violate his nature, then don't use the catchphrase. And take note when a teacher uses it. That teacher may have inadvertently picked up the use of a faulty catchphrase and still be otherwise sound, but a consistent use of faulty catchphrases by a teacher is a warning sign. Fifth, if you determine that a catchphrase is biblical, still consider not using it. The thing about catchphrases is because they've been used so often, they've become overused, and they may not have the punch or the force that they originally had, and people will just utter them without even really thinking about what they're saying anymore. People will hear them without even really thinking about what they're saying because they're so overused. There's an old writer's joke, avoid cliches like the plague. Good writers know to avoid cliches when they're writing because they are so overused. They become tired, and there's probably a better fresher way to communicate than by using a cliche. And so in the same way, if you want to communicate, it is best to avoid using a tired, overused catchphrase. And instead, it's probably better to try to think of another way to say what it is you want to communicate. But 6, if you do decide to use a catchphrase, just be careful to explain exactly what you mean when you're using that catchphrase, and don't leave any room for ambiguity, for being misunderstood. Be careful to define any terms that may be unclear, and consider rephrasing that catchphrase in different words after you use it so that it will be very clear exactly what it is you meant to communicate when you use that catchphrase. Wrapping up this episode, you should never shut off your critical thinking and just passively receive information that is presented to you. Don't go into autopilot, but think carefully about every phrase and every word you encounter. Even prepositions matter. Yes, those tiny little words that maybe you hated learning about in school, but that's the subject for another episode. Always run catchphrases through the grid of the Bible and careful reasoning.